ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, again, something a little bit special. It is the second episode of the Azeroth Book Club. And, well, today we're going to be checking out probably the most talked about Warcraft novel there is going at the moment. That is Before the Storm. We talked about Dawn of the Aspects, went right to the beginning of, well, kind of Azeroth's foundations, and now we're jumping back to the present to talk about things getting a little bit messy between the Horde and the Alliance. And as always, I'm joined by my ever resilient, I guess putting up with me, resilient co-hosts, Nick and Katie. And I am joined by Sleepy Gary, my co-host from Geeks of Azeroth. So I'm going to do a quick roundhouse of people, just how are you doing, and just a little first impression of what you thought about this book. And Katie, you're on the left of my screen, so you get to go first.
I'm doing great. I have read the book twice now because I love it that much.
Wow. Okay.
I got a little dedicated about it, but I wanted to make sure I was prepared for today because I finally get to talk about it. Holy cow. Very excited. I think this book was great. I know Nick and I had, like, Nick was like, oh, what's your favorite, the War Crimes one or this one? I'm like, oh, that's like picking children. Like, this one was such a good addition to the Warcraft lore, so I'm super excited to talk about it. And it has goblins in it, so naturally that doesn't hurt it at all, and its standings in my mind.
Awesome. Nick, hand over to you. How you doing, and what did you think?
I'm doing well. I thought War Crimes was better, but that's not to diminish this book, because it was still very good. It felt very functional, like they needed to move some chess pieces around on a board to set up Battle for Azeroth, and you could kind of see, like, they, like, it's like one of those little, like, maps that you see in, like, a general's room where they got the little stick pushing plastic figures around. Like, you could just see, like, Christie Golden and Afrasiabi, like, sitting somewhere, like, moving people around, like, when they were plotting out this book. I mean, the story kind of started out slow and then got very compelling, as it's centered around that, the one event that we'll get to. But I did enjoy it immensely.
Brilliant. And Gary, welcome to the panel. I would say you're joining a long tradition. It's only been one episode before this, but we're breaking with tradition, bringing you on. And how are you doing? And what did you think of this book?
I really enjoyed it. Also, I have a skewed perception a little bit, admittedly, just because I got it as an audiobook and I drive a lot, so anything that can fill my drive time is great. But no, I loved a lot of this book. I would agree with Nick. It did start off a bit slow, but it definitely picked up, and I didn't find myself, like, dreading the slow parts of the book, because you were still getting a good amount of information, and I feel like I'm a very Horde-centric person, and I even like Anduin a little bit right now. Like, the book did a very good job of portraying characters, so I'm happy with it.
Awesome. And just a quick round the houses. Gary, you had the audiobook. Nick, Katie, did you have the physical copies? Physical copy, I see. Is that hardback as well?
See, I had
Yeah.
Ooh.
I kind of did it hardcore.
Physical and audiobook.
I did, yep.
Okay, so before I kick in, Gary, Katie, what did you think about the whoever read it? I don't know what the voice artist behind the audiobook. I mean, how was that for you?
It's the guy that does Anduin's voice, though.
Yeah, I thought I recognised it. I did listen to it.
That would make a lot of sense. Because he did Anduin really well, and I was like, wow, he sounds just like him. I'm like, that would be why, Katie.
Josh Keaton?
Yeah.
Josh Keaton,
he does a fantastic goblin. Like, you guys should go listen to it. So I'm like, wow, this guy's really nailing it. Like, I wonder if he's done voice work for Blizzard. He has, Katie. Way to go. You were on point with this. So.
You should have tweeted up and said, I love your goblin voice. Not quite nailed the Anduin, but it's okay. There's other people for that. You should.
Anduin was okay, subpar, but, not giving you points for that.
Well, yeah, for me, I very much similar to what all you guys have said. I found myself reading into this. Probably the first 50 pages, I did sit here and think, okay, where's this going? Because I know they, like you said, Nick, that there's a clear end mark they had to get to, and I think it was a little bit hard to, not that this is a criticism, but it was very hard to see how they were going to make up the time in the remaining rest of the book. But after about 200 pages, I just got carried through it. For a 400-page book, or at least it's 400 pages in the softback, I just went through it so briskly, a few hours. And I thought that, it was a great side story to the oncoming conflict. I think it really did a lot to portray some of the central characters, two in particular, I guess, or maybe a handful more. And, it settled it made it very clear that the Horde are the bad guys in this. Because I'm looking at 3 Horde players. You guys don't agree, do you?
No.
No.
I don't agree with myself either. I'm teasing, but the way all your faces dropped, it's like I just ended Christmas. I think that just shows kind of in a sense how, what is at stake with this sort of book, because with this with this expansion coming up, a lot of people have been talking about good guys and bad guys. Does my faction feel like the bad guy? So a book like this had a lot to lose. And I think they got a nice middle ground. I think Christie Golden did a great job. So I guess we might as well dive straight into the story. I'm not sure. Did it for you guys actually settle anything from a faction perspective? Because it got really close into character motivations towards the end. I know that you've got the overall Horde Alliance conflict, but it seemed it was more Anduin and Sylvanas' perceptions of what was going on rather than go Horde, go Alliance. I don't know if you guys would agree.
I think. Go
think-
ahead.
No, you
Nick, go on.
Okay. No, I was gonna say, I think it did a
choose.
great job of setting a dichotomy between Sylvanas and Anduin, because Anduin is very naive, very innocent, very young, and he can't imagine anybody having any sort of malintentions outside of just sort of general malintentions. Because even then he's like, well, she would never attack her own people. She would never do this, because he can't imagine somebody doing that. Whereas Sylvanas, all she can imagine is other people being as conniving and scheming and plotting as she is. And so anytime Anduin does anything, she's like, well, what's he really doing? How's he coming at me? What's his real plan here? And these two characters, because they're because of their viewpoints are so different, that's where all the conflict comes from. I mean, they set up this meeting between the Forsaken and the Alliance, and the whole book is like watching a slow motion car crash. That you just know that there's no way this is going to go well, and the only question is, how is it not going to go well? Which they did a great job of letting it play out as it did. But ultimately, it's Sylvanas' paranoia that's triggered that sets the whole thing off, and she's not evil in that regard. She's distrusting. She doesn't, see the best in people, but it's not out of any sort of explicit malice. It's really extreme self-preservation.
Yeah. Katie?
So I was going to echo Nick there a little bit, where I think in this book they did a really good job of making, at least in my mind, on the Horde side, they made 2 factions. Namely, they focused on goblins because there was a goblin story, and then there's the Forsaken story. To me, they did a really good job showing examples of both how, I would say both have, like in the game, a lot of times they're perceived as evil, or they have very specific motivations for themselves. And in this case, we get to see the Forsaken Council, where it's like, oh, we care about us as a people, and you get to see a very different side of the Forsaken, which was really refreshing. And you also get to see with the story with the goblin and the gnome, Grizzy and Safi, you get to see a different side of goblins on that side. So, that was interesting to compare and to contrast some of, the perceptions people normally have of those races, and I thought that was really cool. And then overall, Sylvanas and Anduin being completely different characters, like Nick was saying, it was really well set up. I think Christine Golden really knocked that out of the park.
Awesome. And Gary, throwing the same thing to you, but adding on as well, you said you're a Horde-centric player. How did you feel? Did you feel bad? Did you feel bad about who you've chosen to ally yourself with?
No, honestly. So
Okay.
I really love Sylvanas as a character in this book. Yes, she's paranoid, and she is conniving, and she's brilliant, and there's a reason she's the leader of the Horde, and why, even though, a lot of the, first Horde races wouldn't normally follow any other Forsaken, but they don't say anything against Sylvanas. They don't trust her, which is probably smart. Let's be honest, right? I wouldn't trust Sylvanas. I think she's a fantastic character, but no, don't trust Sylvanas. but they show her respect still. Like, Horde has a fantastic storyline. So does the Alliance in this book. That being said, I would wager a lot of money at this point that the battle for Azeroth kicks off because Anduin starts it.
It's possible, the book, towards the end, when Sylvanas has obviously massacred her own people, and killed Kalia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, he does say, I have grounds to declare war. Although he does smudge that. He does say, actually, you know what, she's not one of my people and all this, yada, yada, yada. So maybe he doesn't. But, yeah, I can see him maybe deciding that, well, I'm going to kick this off because it's basically a war already. And I guess that's the stage we get to at the end of the book, is that it's all but war at that point. Well, certainly a war of ideas.
That's what I was saying earlier about, like, when moving the pieces around. Anduin is the piece that needed to move the farthest. Mm-hmm. Like, when we go back at BlizzCon and we watched that cinematic, and Sylvanas comes down and she's getting into the fray, you're like, okay, this is what Sylvanas does. This makes complete sense. But then Anduin's there, and I remember the first thought I had when Anduin's there, like, oh, what did Gen do to get Anduin to do this? Because Gen's right there, and you know that Gen's the hostile one there. Anduin is the one who's going to come along reluctantly. And I know, Katie, there's an episode where we were talking about Anduin last year or whatever, and we even said something like, he's not the kind of guy that you see leading on the front lines, which is exactly what we saw in that cinematic. So we're watching that journey, how he becomes that character. And I mean, and he takes that journey right up until the very last line of the book when he finally says, like, Sylvanas is lost. That's where you see, like, he's finally made the calculations that he understands, like, he is going to need to take Sylvanas out at some point. He cannot coexist with a horde led by her, that there's going to be too much conflict between the two of them, and she will not work for a peacetime war chief.
And that's a good point to make. I guess you could also add that what's interesting, linking it back to that cinematic in particular, is that Gen in the cinematic is like, we're about to take Lordaeron, yada, yada, yada. But in a way that reverses kind of, or at least it kind of nullifies the development he had in this book towards the end, because, by the end you sense that the way that Alonsus kind of brings up the question of how would you feel if you got a chance to meet your son as a Forsaken, you start thinking, well, maybe actually he's going to start to see the Forsaken at least as people, not just as enemies in themselves that need to be destroyed. But, again, we don't know his motivations for attacking Lordaeron, unless you've obviously played the beta and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But, in a sense, it kind of reverses that, I guess, because he takes a step back to the Gen we knew at the beginning of the book, which is just they're undead and they need to be exterminated.
I honestly don't think it does, because I don't think the whole idea behind this for Gen or Anduin, honestly, is we need to destroy the Horde or the Forsaken or this group of people. It's, let's remove Sylvanas from the equation and see what we can make do from there. I honestly think if Sylvanas dies, we lose the two-faction mentality in WoW at this point. Because that's what Anduin wants, and it seems like a lot of the other main characters are kind of leaning towards that on the Horde as well. I mean, Varrock Saurfang in the beta has some questionable things happening. Bane, we already know, is friends with Anduin. I mean, that's covered in the book pretty well. So,
I'm fairly certain... Well, I was going to say, I'm fairly certain Jaster Gallywix is going to get his just desserts, so I don't think he's going to take over anything anytime soon.
Well, goblins in general are pretty easy to convince. Hey, we're not going to be the Horde anymore. We're going to join the Alliance. All the money's over there. Okay, we'll come with you.
I was going to say, I don't know. Goblins like conflict because they make a lot of money off of conflict. So I see goblins be like, but if they're friends, like, how are we going to make our money? Like... what are we gonna do? He's like, oh, no. It's like, have you ever heard how prissy night elves are? We'll just get all the night elves to fight each other. It'll be great. We'll make tons of money off of that.
That brings up a good point, because I wanted to talk briefly about how the book presents unity and disunity in the factions. And I think we see it on both sides. You see it from the Alliance perspective, in the sense that not everyone is coming to Anduin's perspective on things, that not even the Night Elves necessarily think that peace is something that can be easily achieved. Those factions that see peace as a goal don't necessarily see it as a realistic one. Whereas the Horde is just a political nightmare. You see very early in that book with the the parade. I don't know what it's called, but that parade,
the march,
Sylvanas,
not parade.
The march,
It's not a
Very
parade.
specific.
No parades.
you know, flags and children and there's merry-go-rounds and all that sort of thing. I must have misread the book, but in that march, Sylvanas obviously, you know, playing politics. It is a very subtle political game being played, but the Horde at that point just seems so disunified. You know, Sao Fang's glaring at Sylvanas, and she pretty much thinks that, you know, if he distrusts her anymore, he could take a stab at trying to be war chief. Bane is obviously not on her side, and she actually at one point comments that Bane should just follow his heart and join the Alliance, which is an interesting comment to make. From your perspective, guys, where do you think, or how unified do you think the factions sit in this book? And if they become more disunified, how far to splitting do you think how close to splitting do you think we've got? And I'll start with you, Gary, because you brought it up.
So unified or this has always been the very strange part that I've found between Alliance and Horde. Alliance are very unified. Like, they disagree with each other, but ultimately, if the king says yes, the answer is yes, and everyone respects that. Whereas with the Horde, it's a ragtag group of people that just didn't fit anywhere else. Like, that's kind of how the Horde came to be. And they don't necessarily trust each other, they don't necessarily like each other, but they don't hate each other, and they are willing to defend each other at all costs. It's like everyone's that weird cousin that you don't really like, but he's still family. That's kind of how I feel about the Horde and their political landscape, I guess.
Katie, Nick, any thoughts on that?
Well, as far as the Horde goes, I find it interesting that the Alliance is several distinct nations that are sort of allied militarily. Like, really, Anduin has no actual say over how Tyrande and Malfurion run Darnassus and you know, what's going on Kalimdor. But for the Horde, like, Sylvanas, even though she's technically just the war chief, she oversees everybody. Like, she technically outranks Bane and Gallywix and everybody. So she can make orders of their nations that the Alliance really can't. And it's interesting that I think maybe in that regard, because Sylvanas is more responsible for them in a way, that it makes her situation harder, whereas Anduin really only has to think about the other nations from a military perspective. And even then, like, the whole little tour that he takes, it's all just a goodwill tour, just to go around and get some FaceTime with everybody, so, you know, just to keep morale up. So in that regard, it's kind of funny that the Horde is actually worse off for that. That if they kind of just step back and let everybody do their own thing and, you know, lessen their interdependence in a way, that actually might ease the political situation. And then, of course, the other side of that coin is that Sylvanas is just incredibly paranoid and suspects everybody for a threat. So even when Bane is, you know, and she's right to be upset that Bane is communicating with Anduin. Although that, you know, that's something that, you know, another leader might look as a possible diplomatic opportunity. But she's right to be concerned about that, because you don't want somebody high ranking in your administration effectively, you know, communicating with the enemy in that regard. So, but it did show though that you know, she still respects the Tauren for bringing them into the Horde all those years ago. That she gives them a little bit more slack because of that. That she knows that the Tauren are on her side.
And it's interesting that Sylvanas is the only one who openly suggests killing other faction leaders. She says that she wants to kill Jester Gallywix. She says, I'll be the one to kill him. At least Nathaniel tries. She says, no, I'm going to do it. And I think, you know, there's the hints of what could happen if Bane were to get any closer to Anduin. Obviously, there's the threat when his little communication with Anduin's discovered. But obviously, as you say, Anduin's never even suggested that. He's only had goodwill towards faction leaders. I guess the only hint, it's not even hostility, it's the idea of heirs that gets brought up between him and Gen. You know, the idea that Anduin could be killed off in this conflict is constantly brought up. So I get, and that brings up what you said, Gary, that, you know, Anduin is the centerpiece of the Alliance, and every faction has a stake in him being safe, which makes his sort of actions towards the end of the book exceedingly reckless, but we can get to that in a minute, I guess. So why don't we jump into some of the characters? So obviously, there's a huge range of characters in this book. Andrew and Sylvanas probably take center stage. We've got Jaina appearing. We've got the character of Elsie. We've got a particular couple that Katie's probably quite keen to talk about, and obviously a load of other characters. So, Katie, why don't we just jump into the rather interesting relationship that happens in Tanaris? Do you want to talk about that and what appealed to you about that?
Yes. So, for those of you that either did or didn't read the book, there's an interesting, I'd almost call it like, not a subplot, but it's like a secondary story. So we get the main story with Sylvanas and Anduin, then we get this really interesting story with a goblin and a gnome. And their names are Grizik Fizzwrench, and Safaretta Flivers. And I loved them. They were wonderful. And it seems kind of an odd story in context of what's happening, like, because you're like, oh, we have this really important Sylvanas Anduin, and then we have like these two engineers that are essentially working on Azerite, and they're trying to figure out its properties, and you're like, okay, like at first I was like, I really love this story, but I'm not sure why it's here. I was like, okay, it seems like a weird thing to put in, but if you think about it broadly, you can actually see, at least in my opinion, this is how it's supposed to look. Like, you can see the benefits of Azerite, and you can, like, when it's used in a good way, it brings people together. It causes good feelings, I think, all these kind of things. It brought Safaretta and Grizik used to be married, and according to them, they were only married for about a year before it tragically fell apart. But when they start working on Azerite, they come back together, and they're like, oh, like, it rekindles their love for each other. Like, it's this very sweet story, and you're like, wow, you know, Azerite has had this incredible impact on them. And then you look at the Anduin and Sylvanas, and like, they've both touched Azerite. They've kind of been in the mix with it. They're not using it in the same way, but it, like, I almost wonder if that's supposed to be like the opposite, like how destructive it can be. Like, I don't know if it, like, has kind of, how do I say this? Like, it has kind of caused them both to go to a more extreme in their personality, maybe temporarily, but like Sylvanas, like, it's like, oh, like when she grabs it, she's like, oh, I can become like this amazing leader. I can be so cunning and I can rule the world. And you're like, hold on, Sylvanas, like, take a step back here. But, yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, go on.
No, I was just gonna say the Grizik and Safaretta story was very cute, and I loved it. It's kind of tragic, but very cute.
I have a question. Yes. Did they die at the end?
So that's the great mystery. I hope not. Like, I don't think they've been data mined, but I keep...
There's no information I can find on them. I
really hope in-game, if they are dead, that they just patch a smoking crater somewhere in Tanaris. It's morbid, but it would make my day.
Oh my god, why?
Or if they just show up somewhere, like, say, patch 8.1 or something, we go to an island, or during, like, say, one of the island expeditions, if you can just randomly happen upon this gnome and goblin that ran away together. Like, it would be fantastic. Any continuation of that story, or even just a little nod to it in WoW, would be great, because it was a fantastic story.
I was just going to jump in real quick here. It's an interesting parallel where you can see, again, like, two people from opposite factions getting together really well, like, and then, you know, the Horden Alliance, the typical Horden Alliance, where they try to get together and it doesn't work, so it's like, there are a lot of parallels between the main story and this cute little off story, and you're like, oh, that's, like, I don't know, stuff that I didn't think about the first time. I kind of thought about the first time, but it struck home a little more the second time I was reading it, so.
See, outside of like the, like, Sylvanas to Gallywix to the couple connection, I kept waiting for this to tie back into the main story, and so, like, at the meeting at the end, I'm like, is, like, some kind of Azerite war machine gonna show up and destroy everything, and we're gonna find out, like, the weapons that they built, like, are finally gonna get used, and that's gonna mess up this whole meeting, and it never paid off in that way, and it really felt like I said, outside of those tenuous connections, it really felt tacked on. Like, this is here just to explain how you're gonna have Azerite armor in the next expansion and not much else. But I see Katie's
shaking.
I am shaking because they specifically mention that they've made it into a necklace. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
So
But that sounds familiar as far as that's coming in Battle for Azeroth,
Yes.
but it doesn't tie into the A plot. It's just its own. Yeah, but it's just its own thing. Even if Magni had shown up at some point and been like, "What are these blueprints?" and so at least it would explain later on, because I think he's involved with us getting that necklace or something. Unless they're involved with it, maybe they show up there and they're the ones that give us the necklace at some point.
I was going to say it was interesting because when they talked about their death scene. So just a quick recap. They get into some bad water with Gallywix because Grizzic is working for Gallywix, and Staffy's like, "You gotta run away, Grizzy, like this is gonna end terribly because goblins are mobsters and I love them for that." But anyway, so it predictably goes south. So Grizzy and Staffy try to run away, they get caught, and they get strapped to a bomb. Or they get strapped together and I think they get a bomb placed at their feet. Something to that nature. And the one thing that they're talking about is that they had made a ring that had azurite in it, and they're like, okay, maybe this ring will save us, because, like, it has protective properties, maybe we won't die. And so, like, that seems like a really interesting thing to throw in there, and you're like, otherwise it'd be like, oh, I love you, and then, pff, and you're like, oh, that would be terrible, but you're like, oh, like, they mentioned it, so I don't know if they're giving us false hope, or if they're trying to explain more of the properties, or I would be willing to bet we're going to see them again since they took up a huge chunk of the story. At least I hope so, because they spent a lot of time developing those characters only to brutally murder them, which is not...
I like Gary's approach. I think we should go to Tenarius, find a little smoking crater and a hand clutching for air, and we just pluck the ring off the finger and then disappear.
I'm just gonna go cry now, excuse me.
The one thing I am really curious about, so when me and Britza were on your guys' show, months ago, I think at this point, I don't know, time ago, we had talked about the possibility of Azerite, maybe this is the cure of the Forsaken just constantly falling apart. And it seems like it could be from that storyline. Like, I feel like that's half the setup for this, because it does feel like that part of the story was put in there for more reasons than just, here's a cute little story that kind of shows you possibilities of how things can work.
Yes.
I think there is more to it, and I half wonder if that might be it, especially with some of the other characters that were introduced at the same time, or in the same book at least.
I like that, and I definitely feel that romance was definitely, because even the way I think that it was set up, where what's her name, Saffronetta, the way she was sitting with the Explorers League, and so she's, she was in that group of dwarves and elves. She has that moment with one of the night elves who's protecting them, and they talk about the moon and peace with the earth and that sort of thing. And you see this wonderful scene of alliance unity, and then it goes into the horde chaos. There's an actual conflict. People get killed quite brutally. And then you get this nice romance of two somewhat opposing factions joining together. And I definitely think that was the crux of it, to show how even through conflict there can be unity afterwards. But no, I think that'd be a cool way to link it back. I think everything else got destroyed, didn't it? They talk about she burnt her nose, they wrecked the place, the bomb didn't go off, but there isn't necessarily weapons to be used. So it's in a position where it could be rounded off, I guess, if it wanted to. But at the same time, I think it does present a nice idea of coexistence, which is obviously contrasted to the Forsaken, and what a rough time they have in this book. And I guess we could talk about the Forsaken in general, because they do get it rough.
They do.
There's a huge amount of emotional investment in the Forsaken and how they respond. I mean, this could be arguably the book that defines the Forsaken. Regardless of how they turn out, because I guess looking at how Kalia turns out, there could be a future for the Forsaken in a different means, but we'll go into that. So, looking at the Forsaken in general, I mean, how did you feel their portrayal in this book was? Nick, I'll go straight to you.
They were really interesting because I know early on we read I guess it was chapter 2 that we were given back at BlizzCon. and it introduced this idea of the Desolate Council. And we're like, well, who are these people? Are they going to be like the threat? Is like one of the big cruxes of the book? Is that going to be like Sylvanas versus the Council? And it wasn't really, because they were, at least led by Elsie. Like, they really just rolled over. Like, they were like, look, you're not here. We're just going to fulfill this job. We love you, Sylvanas, and we're going to work with you. And Sylvanas, of course, was like, I don't trust you. I'm going to have to kill you at some point. But, and even at the end, when Gen is like, look, like, Sylvanas was going to kill these people at some point, no matter what. Like, Anduin was never going to be able to save these people. Like, he's absolutely right. But you really see that I think Blizzard has always kind of been a little bit vague about just how human the Forsaken are. That we always hear about Sylvanas, and she's not feeling, and she doesn't have the same like range of emotions that like living people have. And it was always kind of, but it's like she still seems to have feelings for her sisters, and even Sylvanas seems to struggle with that a little bit. And now it's like flat out we're getting Forsaken that have open feelings for the living, that they're not just cold and shut off like we've always sort of been told that they are. And so when you look at that and you realize, one, that Sylvanas is trying to like manage these people and almost force them to be cold and dead in a way, that she doesn't want to like rekindle their old lives. You realize that like Sylvanas is really projecting like her situation onto everybody. But at the same time, you see these Forsaken that want to like live. And it's one of those things, it's almost kind of a shame that it took like 30 years of game time, or I don't know, I guess 15 years, I think it was, since the initial sacking of Lordaeron under Arthas, that it took that long for these people who are separated to finally have a means of communicating again. I mean, that's heartbreaking. And I think that's one of the most emotionally resonant scenes in the book, is when the Forsaken and the Alliance people actually do come together, and you have the families reunited. You have the Fellstone family, and you have Parcel and Philia, or Parkwall and Philia rather. Like when you see all these people finally come together, I mean that's the heart of the book, like literally. And to know that like the Forsaken are capable of this, it kind of casts the whole book with like this almost like melancholy that why did it take so long? This should have happened long ago. And it almost highlights like a tragedy that like the only race that was willing to accept the Forsaken back in the day was the Tauren, that they had to be like, hey, we see that you guys can be redeemed and we're going to bring you into the Horde. And they got Thrall on board because Sylvanas did send emissaries to Stormwind and they never made it. And you can understand like it would take Stormwind a little bit of while to realize like, oh, hey, those zombies are still my friends. But 15, that's an eternity in this. It's got to be more than 15 years. It's got to be closer to 20 now, isn't it?
Well,
it's been like forever.
What's her name? The young girl, is it Philia? I can't remember. She was born in Lordaeron, and she's only about 15, so it can't be as much longer than that.
It would have to be somewhere right around that, though, because I mean, Anduin would have been a baby. Now he seems like a man, at least. I mean, I'm guessing. I'm guessing between 18 and 21. That ballpark.
He's a man doing now.
Yeah.
He's a man doing.
But what I find really interesting about this is this book brought up a lot of issues the Forsaken have that no one would have bothered to think about. Like, hey, we're terrified of doing anything accidental because we don't heal naturally. We stitch new parts on, and if those parts aren't the same as the old ones, we can't do what we used to. Like, the blacksmith that comes in, who loses his arm in a smelting accident, and is never going to be able to smith again because the new arm isn't bulky enough to hold the hammer that he uses to smith with. And having that, well, you're pretty much immortal, but you know what you spent your entire life doing? Yeah, can't do that anymore. So better find a new hobby, because you're still going to be alive for a long time. And that's tragic. I mean, it would be to any of us like, hey, we're going to make you immortal. Katie, we're going to make you immortal, but you can never play WoW again. Ever. Like,
oh, no. The worst.
You get the bad part of immortality. That's it.
I think
You can play mage. You can roll what's left of your face across the keyboard.
No! I can't play Clothies, I'm so terrible!
You'll probably max the DPS meters. I tend to do that. So.
I think, though, there's a positive spin on this, is that instead of being like, oh, like, you got your hand replaced and you can't do what you were doing before, now you can seek out somebody like, oh, hey, well, if I want to be a blacksmith, let me find a great blacksmith, and I'll just rip his hand off, and I'll put it on mine, and now I can blacksmith like awesome. Or, if I want to be a great mage, I'll find a great mage, and I'll take his arm, or, whatever I need from him, and bam, now I can cast spells like it's nobody's business. So, if anything, I think it encourages some of them to become more like serial killers.
Possibly.
I don't think we read the same book.
Well, I think in some ways it showed. I wonder if it showed too much of a vulnerability with the Forsaken, because if they are that fragile, they even talk about it at the Gathering. Like, some people were scared. I think Philia was nervous about, or they make a comment about she had to gently squeeze his hand because any more and he'd probably start falling apart. Like, the undead, the Forsaken still have warriors. Like, how the hell do the Forsaken characters hold themselves together when they're getting beaten up by Fell Reavers and goodness knows what?
I would assume it's the situation where our characters are not your average member of a given race, and so therefore, like, our player Forsaken is one of the hardiest and sturdiest Forsaken that are out there, and we're able to get by with bandages and cannibalism. Mm-hmm. So we don't need to stitch ourselves back together. We're, even though our bones are sticking out all over the place, we're still held together enough that it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and they did note in the book, too, that not all Forsaken are quite as fragile. Like, some are, but others are, near mummified corpses. Some are like they were when they were living, with almost no rot or decay whatsoever. So there is a wide variety. Or, there's a few select ones like Nathanos and I think basically the Dark Rangers who have had whatever ritual to make their bodies much more resilient to any kind of damage.
Yes. It's actually interesting. I was really glad that they portrayed the Forsaken this way, because they actually have been portraying the Forsaken this way for quite some time in the game, but it's not things you see. Like, they're little subtle things in quest text. Like, if you go through, like, as I said, I have a friend that is, like, completely in love with the Forsaken, so she knows everything about them, so I've gotten to learn a ton from her. Like, she's, like, the Forsaken half of my Goblin half. Like, she's like, oh yeah, I've read every single quest text, and I have them all memorized, and I know all these NPCs. But it's interesting because there's so many different quests that do talk about their vulnerability, and you don't see a lot of it. Like, I think there's one quest I can think of specifically where you go and you find this female Forsaken, and she's decaying, and you get to finally hear about how they gradually become nothingness, and they actually start to lose what's left of their sanity, and they just kind of devolve. And she's like, oh, could you bring me a blanket so in my last moments I could, of sanity, I can cuddle in this blanket and just kind of go silently. And you're like, oh, like, it just hits you right in the feels. You're like, God, that's horrible. Like, can't we do anything to help them? And it's been at least it's been a plot for a long time, especially with my Forsaken friend. They need to find a way to help the Forsaken, because they've had this plight for so long that hasn't been addressed story-wise, because, we had Deathwing, we had all these other major characters come through. And so I was really happy that this book finally focused on that, because it'd be like, if something big happened to the Tauren and then everyone ignored it for years and years. Like, it's like, oh yeah, all the Tauren and Thunder buff, like, Magatha came through and raised half the place, but now we're not going to talk about it. And you're like, but Grim Totem, like, it's... Which there are still problems with the Grim Totem, but we'll get to that.
Yep.
But
just a few.
Just a few. But I was just really happy that we actually got to see that side of the Forsaken, because if you spend a lot of time in Undercity and you talk to the NPCs, they actually do reflect that a lot more, and it's really surprising, because you think of them all as like, oh, the Dark Lady, and but most of them are like, oh, hello. They'll wave at you and a finger will fall off, and you're like, did you drop this? They're like, oh, it happens, dear, don't worry. And you're like, okay, like, that's fine, but you're falling apart. I don't know. They're not as, like, dark and ominous as a lot of times they're portrayed on the surface. So I was very happy to see that reflected in this book finally. And they're just people. Like, they're people from Lordaeron, and they just wanted nothing more than to go home, and then everyone thinks they're horrible monsters. So I don't know.
And that's got a sense of deja vu from me, because I think Christie Golden would have got herself into a bit of a pickle if she had mentioned anything to do with the Death Knights in this novel.
That's true.
Because I think we went through the same thing with the Death Knights, where they were dead, they were brought back to life by Arthas, and you do the quest, you get shouted out by the citizens of your various capitals, you get hated and that sort of stuff. And I do sit there and wonder, I know the Death Knights exist in the Ebonhold, they kind of sit very far away from the factions and in fact transcend them, but I feel like the Death Knights kind of already went through this. And I do wonder if they kind of would have been the problem in this plot, in that, why weren't messages exchanged through the Death Knights? You got dead people in your faction, you could at least associate with them. If from the Horde perspective, that is, Forsaken could speak to Death Knights, pass messages on to their Death Knight Alliance counterparts, and also just the idea. And I guess we can move into how other factions respond. I find it odd how Turalyon and Gen can tolerate Death Knights, but can't tolerate the Forsaken as citizens, Forsaken citizens in particular, not soldiers. That kind of struck with me a little bit.
Do they?
I don't think they
mean,
do, especially after the Order
obviously
stuff.
they have to on some level, but they don't. I mean, you're right. They make sure they don't even mention the word Death Knight when talking about the history of Strom and what happened to Galen. They're just like, and then Galen died, and then we move on. and that's the Death Knight campaign where you take him out so you can get was it Thoris Trollbane as your one of your followers.
Yeah.
So they are very careful not to mention that, and I do find it interesting that you're right that it's not just the Death Knights at this point. After Legion, they could have picked any class. Any class hall had Alliance and Horde working together and would have had Forsaken and Alliance members working together. And it's interesting that they picked Priest, I guess mostly because it was Anduin, and it allowed them, the main characters all in this were all priests, that it worked out very well in that regard. But I guess in that way, it almost makes sense that this comes on the heels of Legion, that after we had, sort of as player characters, we eschewed our alliances, our factions, in a greater name of class unity. It would make sense that this would happen coming out of that as a result of the Horde and the Alliance and the Forsaken and the Alliance working together much more closely, that yes, that's when these lines of communication would wind up opening it up. So I'm just disappointed that the Priest Order Hall is the one that played so much importance on this when I don't play a priest at all.
Yes.
If it was the Hunter Order Hall, I would have been way more into this book.
I think it had to be priests, though.
Yeah.
For everything they were trying to line up, because you can't tell me Kalia is not a big, important part of the story coming up. It's set up, it's obvious. I would call it foreshadowing, but that... I think it's too obvious to even call foreshadowing. It's just
I think there's no finesse.
Yeah.
We'll come to Kalia at a point, because I think there's some definite theory crafting about the role Kalia will play.
Yes, but legitimately, I think the other classes were probably unified, but Priest was unified in a way to improve others, I guess, more so than a lot of the other classes were. Death Knights were hanging out with Death Knights probably because no one else wants to hang out with Death Knights. Including Forsaken. They're like, we're undead, but that's different.
And I guess you could understand that, because Death Knights were a bit closer to Arthas when they had, there's a bit of a moral grey area, but I can see your point.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like one of the reasons they had to jump into the Priest Order Hall is they had to show that was it Foul? I think they had to show a Forsaken that was dedicated to something that wasn't dark magic, or I feel like they needed to shake it up and be like, hey, here's a Forsaken that's a priest that's dedicated to the light, purely to the light. That's their first, that's his first, dedication. He's not affiliated with the Dark Lady, so we've taken a neutral Forsaken, which there aren't a ton of, but I feel like they had to have that in the mix for Anduin to meet. So he's like, oh, hey, not all Forsaken are horrible people. Look, here's one that's hanging out with the light. That's why they couldn't put it in another Order Hall, because there aren't a ton of Forsaken that have any other sort of neutral, affiliation. So I just seem like the most.
Could have been the Hunter Hall. Here's a Forsaken. He loves his dog. Surely Gen can understand that.
Sorry.
Well played.
So, Gary, you were saying something before I jumped in.
I've forgotten whatever I was saying. I'm sure it was the best thing that you had ever heard, and now you're just missing out.
It would have made it. We could have ended the show on that point, but alas, we must go searching for answers elsewhere. And, I guess it just seems somewhat odd that, and I guess that's kind of the point of the book, the idea of, it's not faction hatred. I think I can understand why the factions still distrust each other, but it's the intolerance on one level, given the fact it's not just that we've worked with Death Knights, that we've worked with Demon Hunters, and that we've worked with a variety of races, but we're about to welcome in, goodness, Void Elves, and, all these other classes, or we already have to an extent, I guess. We are happy to open the gates to anyone who has some sort of power, and yet, the idea of Forsaken coming and speaking to their loved ones is suddenly abhorrent. I find it odd, but I think that's kind of the point. So there's that. But we mentioned Callie, and I want to come to Callie in a minute, but I want to talk about Elsie, and I guess by extension Will. Elsie more so in particular because she's obviously the head of the Desolate Council, the governor. I think it is. They have governors, ministers, and listeners, if I'm right.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it matters much now.
Well, yeah. They had. Past tense, all that stuff. What did you make of Elsie? Because I think she was obviously the embodiment of the Forsaken coming around to wanting to do that sort of thing. And at the same time, you pointed out, Nick, that she openly admits, I'm no Putris. I'm not gonna, we're not here to overthrow Sylvanas. And at that point, I was like, really? That could have been kind of fun, to see at least some political toying going on.
Isn't that what Putris would have said, though?
Yeah.
He wouldn't have admitted, I'm here to no. He would have played innocent until the time.
He would just unleash the plague. He would just push the red button. I don't know. What did you guys think of Elsie as a character?
I really liked her. I thought that she was, again, just a great example of the non-typical Forsaken. She's like, oh, dearie, don't worry, I'll just stitch your hand back on. And I'm like, oh, here's this cute, I want to say a little grandmotherly type Forsaken. And she's like, oh, well, don't mind me and all my bones. I know I look a fright, but da-da-da. I'm like, oh, she's just so cute. I'm like, I'm so, my heart just was wrenched because I it's one of those things when you're introduced.
Hers was as well by an arrow.
When you're introduced to the character, you're like, there's no way she's going to survive this encounter because she's too sweet, she's too forward thinking, which I was immediately like, oh no, they're going to do something horrible and she's going to die in a horrible way and this is going to be just awful. Because I think what's interesting about her versus Sylvanas is, and she also makes a very interesting point. So Elsie is very sweet and open, and she is listening to the Forsaken, but she makes a very important point that I think was maybe, I don't want to say glossed over, but it was subtle enough that I think it was really important, where she says that she notices that the Forsaken that have too much rage in their hearts become very closed-minded, it changes them in a negative way. And I believe that's a one-for-one for what we're seeing with Sylvanas, because basically they've talked about how Sylvanas can only feel anger, and it's just this kind of it's really bad for Forsaken. And so when Elsie's like, oh, I try and stay so positive and happy, and you can see how different she is from Sylvanas. She's, I don't know, I would they're polar opposite characters, and I think that's what makes the distinction between the two so interesting, because if you had Elsie leading the Forsaken, everyone would be like, oh, she's so sweet, what a cute little grandmotherly lady that's just oh, I just have.
But they would get steamrolled by Gen in about 5 minutes.
Exactly. But they don't want to fight, they just want to reunite, as a people, they just want to actually be a people. And I think the problem is that Sylvanas is so afraid, like we were talking about earlier, Sylvanas is so afraid that her people will leave her. I'm fairly certain the major motivation behind Sylvanas' fear, as much as she doesn't want to admit that she's ever afraid of anything. But anyway, I loved Elsie. I thought she was the cutest. I imagined her sitting there, knitting in a little chair when someone comes in her clinic. She's like, oh, dearie, what fell off today? And I'm like, she's just I was very sad.
The Alliance were at the front door, Elsie. What do we do?
Just makes little
Invite them
doilies for
in.
everyone. Like, yeah. She was wonderful.
Nick, Gary, any thoughts on Elsie? Or
Katie said something a moment ago about Elsie talking about how like the rage, the Forsaken with rage closed them off. And I'm thinking about what we said earlier about Azerite and how, in a way, it's almost like has like a magnifying property to it. Like they were doing those experiments where they were able to take it and heal the plants, and you know, when they like gave it good things, like the plants grew big. But then when they mixed it with the right mixture of poison, it killed the plants like immediately.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And so I know that the Forsaken, they come through Titanic means, if you think about where the Valkyr, their origins, as far as how they've resurrected the Forsaken, and even then, Arthas, though, he comes from, I guess, Legion origins, as it were. I should say the Lich King, rather. But I'm trying to piece if there's not some kind of connection here between, like, the Forsaken in that state where your entire existence is just magic fueled at that point. You're not living based off any biological means at that point. And if your emotions can like affect you in that way, that like, you know, rage becomes worse, you know, or you know, like nice becomes nicer, like something like that. Like, is this like an inherent property of Azeroth? Like, because the Forsaken were raised on Azeroth? Like, is this giving us like an insight maybe into the type of Titan that Azeroth is, that we're seeing its blood have this effect? And now these are characters who never actually directly interacted with the blood, but they were raised on this planet. Is there a connection there, or I'm probably just overthinking things?
Well, it is an interesting, it's an interesting point, because prior to this, we didn't really understand, at least I think she's supposed to be a lens in how Forsaken society works, because we don't get a very coherent lens on it most of the time. And I mean, that could certainly be, like, we've already seen how Azerite does have those properties. I don't know, like, Azerite brings into so many, like, factors into the equation. You're just like, like, I feel like that guy, that crazy picture of the guy with a whiteboard, he's like, theories! That's basically me right now.
I think the issue is not only Azerite, but also Forsaken, because the Forsaken as a race is just messy. Because there's Forsaken born of several different methods at this point, including a new one introduced in this book, and all of them are just kind of lumped together because they were once alive and now they're not quite. So how are the different ones affected differently? Are they all the same? Like, where is the true root of the Forsaken going to end up in? Because that's really obvious with a lot of the other races. You know, humans were born from, you know, Valkyr, I think, were their original, which was Titan before that. So, like, you have this lineage. Dwarves started out as, you know, constructs from the Titans, got the curse of the flesh. We know where they come from. Forsaken were just like, well, Arthas came around and he raised a bunch of undead, and then some of them decided that they were gonna have free will suddenly. And now we have the Forsaken. And Sylvanas helped with this, kinda? And she's the Dark Lady, and she rules over all of them, and they all love her. Like, that's kind of the origin we know, and I don't think they necessarily need to explain it, because I don't think the Forsaken really know either. They're just like, hey, I woke up as an undead, and I'm good with it. I'm gonna keep living, or kind of living like this. But it'd be a really interesting point to explore, either in the expansion or, you know, maybe even in another book, of, you know, where the root of the Forsaken really comes from. Why can these undead not be mindless?
Yeah, and I think that there's... Again, we'll come to Kalia and where we think the Forsaken are going to go, because I think that kind of... They almost spell out the future of the Forsaken at the end in some ways. But I think, you know, the point on Azerite, you know, I think we mentioned when we were on TNG, you know, Azerite... I was going to use the phrase, it's some sort of like Deus Ex Machina, but have either any of you seen Limitless with Bradley Cooper? It's
no, but I'm familiar with it.
No, so he takes a pill and suddenly he becomes mentally he becomes Superman. He can just remember everything, he can do everything and all that sort of stuff. And it seems that that's what Azerite kind of is for a lot of the living races. It's cocaine, basically, mega cocaine. And I'm reluctant to say that I wonder if we're all going to be like shivering heaps by the end of this expansion because we've taken so much Azerite and we joked about going to rehab, didn't we?
Yes.
Yes.
That's how our followers are going to be part of an intervention quest line at the beginning of the next expansion. But I am interested. I am interested to see where Azerite goes because it seems almost so potent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you get to a point where you take that away from the story? Like, do we mine all of it? Like, it has to go away because it can't stick around forever. And I do wonder,
it's also
it's so powerful.
Sorry. I was going to say it's also the blood of Azeroth, so we can't keep mining it because we will kill the planet.
Right. Well,
yeah, screw that.
If you want to get rid of the thing that's bleeding, or if you want to get rid of the blood, get rid of the thing that's bleeding. So that means, what if this ends with Azeroth awakening? And, at that point, we don't have to worry about mining any more Azerite because Azeroth the Titan is now free to leave the planet and go do whatever. I mean, what if this battle for Azeroth winds up being what if that's the thing? The only way that Azeroth can properly heal, given that there's a giant sword sticking in its egg, for lack of a better term, is to get out of the egg, and then you can get in and heal. Because we're not removing that sword. I mean, we don't. Physically, we do not have the capability. I don't even know if magically we do. And I mean, we'll see what happens when we depower our artifacts in 8.0, but. What if that's sort of the end game here is that we don't have to worry about Azerite after this expansion because Azeroth I think it's herself, right? It's a she.
I think so.
So,
yeah.
What if she goes to the next form and is we just don't have to deal with that anymore?
I think it's just a bunch of goblin rockets strapped to the top of the sword. Yank it out.
Yes.
That raptor from Ajara is going to come back with a space flute, and then they'll pull the sword out.
Yes, subject 9, I think.
Well, it's WoW game logic. As big as it is, it will still fill only one bag slot. So I reckon we could still put it in a bag.
We just need to.
I don't think it needs that much.
I want to see that in Diablo. How many slots in your bag would it be there?
What it really comes down to is we just need a gnome to equip it. It'll just shrink down to gnome size.
Oh my gosh. That'd be hilarious.
Then it's, the Sargeras toothpick. But that is something interesting because, again, kind of bringing up your point, Nick, about chess pieces, it starts with Silithus. The very first chapter is based in Silithus, the mining for Azerite, and the sword kind of gets put into the background. There's all this talk with Anduin and the other races about, we need to save Azeroth, but it quickly gets fuddled with not we need to get that sword out, it's we need to stop mining Azerite because we can't kill each other with it. I do wonder, is that, again, this is coming from my muddled understanding of what we're going to do in 8.0, but I do wonder if we're less concerned, or the book was less concerned with showing how we're going to heal Azeroth and how we're just, rather than how we're simply not just going to take advantage of Azeroth. So, again, it's trying to get to a point with the expansion coming up, but I did find it odd that the sword perhaps didn't get mentioned, because, they're doing all this stuff like reuniting families, and, I guess in the scheme of things, Anduin, you ain't got time for that stuff.
Yeah.
You need to seriously start thinking about that sword. But, I guess, again, it's about getting us to somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem with the sword, though, is that it's just so big that, you can't wrap your mind around it. There's, you can't pull it out. You can't do anything to it. It's there, and so your options are either just kind of stare at it and accept the grim fate, this is probably going to kill the planet and we're all going to die, or just not think about it and be like, hey, let's reunite everybody. Just get your mind onto something else and try to live every day the best you can, because the alternative is just soul crushing.
We could all go to Outland, I guess. That's still going about. Isn't it?
I mean, if Azeroth is born, hatched, whatever you want to call it, I mean, I'm guessing that Azeroth will look like Outland. It'll be all fractured and separated because I think they just out of a planet and the planet just.
We don't.
Yeah,
know.
we really
do
don't
not know what happens to the Titan planets.
Well,
and it could. But here's the thing: like, I mean, if you look at Sargeras, where he like turns into that cloud form, or even the other Titans, they all kind of like had like they. I could almost see like Azeroth just kind of like a giant cloud just kind of coming out of all the fissures where the Azerite is coming, and then materializing in the sky. Maybe Azeroth herself pulls the sword out of the planet and then goes away.
But then are we going to call it Azeroth still? Like, is it like Azeroth's hatched egg? Like, what?
Well, yeah.
There's a lot we
she's the Titan Azeroth. We're still on the planet Azeroth,
which is named after the Titan. But
it's named after the Titan. Yeah, but Kalimdor is the continent. But Kalimdor was also the giant continent where the Eastern Kingdoms were. Technically, Azeroth was also the name of the kingdom.
That's true.
Back in the day.
Back in the day, though.
So yeah,
that's old news.
Names are names. Maybe she'll tell us, like, actually, my name's not Azeroth. It's like,
Helen.
Sally.
My name is Sally. You're like, oh, so we live on planet Sally? And she's like, Earthlings. I don't know.
Yeah, we must save Sally.
Salians.
Yeah, we're all Salians now.
Yeah. Moving on, because I feel like we could.
We're getting way off.
Yeah.
So your question about Elsie, she was a good character.
Elsie, she was a good character. Gary, before we go on to some of the other characters, any thoughts on Elsie?
She killed herself as soon as she started going by the name Elsie.
Pretty much.
That is, as soon as she went, hey, I was once human, and I'm in this position of power right now because you're not here, Sylvanas. Sylvanas is like, nope, you are going to die. And I think as soon as someone else someone else starts walking towards the Alliance, another Forsaken, I don't remember who. And that's the...
I think that was Parqual.
Oh, yeah. And that is the moment Sylvanas is like, and now it's a pattern, so you all have to die. Like, I think legitimately, she just needed one more.
Well, I mean, like...
So it's Elsie's fault. Okay. I'm happy with that.
Well, I mean, she was even killing the ones that were running back towards her gate. So, which
Elsie was. Elsie was heading back because she realized, like, she wasn't... Because she didn't have anybody to meet there. She was just there to see the event.
But Sylvanas goes in and says the only ones worth saving are the ones who instantly came back because they weren't lingering on the hope that they could be reunited or they could have something to enjoy with living people. And I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
The ones who were rejected and therefore broken.
Yes. She doesn't want people that are hopeful. Because I think, again, like, that seems to be this weird...
She's the anti-Obama.
Well, yeah.
Well, she's just I think she's very afraid. Like, she doesn't want her people to have another life. Like we were talking about earlier, that seems to be a very consistent Sylvanas theme where she's like, I want everyone to feel miserable, but I want to be your savior. So like, I want you all to feel horrible and awful, but I want to be like your savior, and so you all love me and cherish me. And I'm like, Sylvanas, like that's not a good thing. You're being kind of horrible right now.
Well, and I don't know how much of it is actually that, and how much of it Sylvanas is like. I don't think she wants them to feel terrible. I just think that she's asking them to accept who they are now, because who they are now will never be who they used to be.
That's true.
Like, you're a Forsaken, you are no longer human. Learn to live with that. But
that's Sylvanas projecting her situation on
absolutely.
She's no longer the elf that she used to be, and she's struggling to even bring her family back together, and so she is therefore assuming, well, none of you should have family if I can't have family.
Yes.
And and so anybody that does, she's lashing out at them.
Well, and it's a weird, like, she, as we were just saying, it's like she's projecting her feelings of, like, there are other Forsaken that had tried prior to connect to their families, and their families tried to kill them. Like, that's one of the themes in, if you go around, I want to say it's like Brill or something, like some of the other Forsaken basically tell your character, they're like, hey man, like, if you have family, you can't go back and see them because they'll try and murder you. Or, you know, like, they'll think that you're this crazy monster, and it just doesn't go well. Like, it actually, there are a lot of Forsaken that have lost their sanity over this, because they're like, I'm not a monster, I just want to see my family, and they go see their family, and their family tries to kill them, and the Forsaken becomes this either really bitter Forsaken, they're like, well, you know, nobody can ever accept me again, and they start to hate all living creatures just purely because of that, which makes sense. But, you know, I think in her own, I would say it's kind of a twisted way, Sylvanas is trying to prevent that for a lot of her people, but she's also harming them now much more than helping them, and it's not that she doesn't... It's weird, because, like, she does know that, and she doesn't know that, but it's, like, this weird way over protectiveness, but it's, yeah. I don't know.
I think there's certainly a couple of routes that could be pulling at Sylvanas. I think one of the things that stands out is the comic that came out recently with the Three Sisters,
Yes.
and the reaction the Void voice in Illyria's head had to Sylvanas. I do wonder how much influence is external to Sylvanas, so it'd be interesting to see that. But we'll certainly come to Sylvanas in a minute. I want to group together a bunch of characters just to touch on them very briefly before we go into Kalia, Anduin, and Sylvanas, and that's Jaina, who briefly appears, and I'm going to rope in Turalyon and Greymane. Jaina makes an appearance, which is, nice. We get that brief moment with Kalik. Again, interesting. I wonder if that's a contrast. You've got two members of a quite friendly faction, who can't reconcile their relationship because of differing ideals and things like that. So that was an interesting contrast, but... Again, we simply get to another place. We had to get Jaina to... Well, at least we had to reveal her motivations, which are quite grim. She just doesn't feel like she has nothing that motivates her. Nothing. She makes a comment that she's always been reacting against things up until that point, and that she hasn't been doing anything for herself. She has no motivations and things like that. And how do you guys feel about that? Is that in that brief window we see Jaina? Do you think that's a good place to leave her as we go into BFA, or do you think we should have seen more? Maybe.
I don't think we're not leaving her going into BFA. No. We're picking her up going into BFA. But no, that chapter was interesting because that to me felt like it should have been like a short story in the middle of Legion, and they put it in here because they needed to put this somewhere to finally just tie up that relationship. And I guess it made sense to let Christie Golden do it since she, started that back in Tides of War. But I guess the only reason it really felt like they needed that in there is because that reminds you that, oh yeah, like Anduin used to look up to Jaina, and now Jaina's kind of turned her back on him. And well, hey, here comes Kalia, so he can just start projecting like, you're the new Jaina, and all those feelings that he had for her get thrown over to Kalia, which really sets up why he lets her do what he lets her do at the end, because he's thinking like, you're Aunt Jaina, you're good, you wouldn't do this, or I guess you're new Aunt Jaina. And that's like, that's the only reason I can feel like they put that in there. Otherwise, that chapter, it really kind of stuck out, like, as far as why it was in the book.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It is really odd for the book itself. It probably would have served better as a short story, because it doesn't play a whole large role in the book, it doesn't feel like. But I did find it really interesting. The Jaina in there pretty much just says, hey, I'm not really mad at Dalaran or anyone here. Like, I get why you let the Horde back in. It was the right choice to make, but it's not a choice I can live with, and I won't be here because of it. Like, she was very down to earth about it, but she was just like, no, I can't. I hate the Horde, and that's just how it is. Like, it gave me a little bit of respect for Jaina's character, especially with how she left during Legion, because, like, you're just like, well, she's crazier than the Forsaken with a half-rotten brain. But now you kind of get this insight where she's like, hey, look, I know what's going on. I was doing my part, but I couldn't be here to do it. And I feel like that's a fair place for her character, especially with everything that's happened to her.
Yeah, and as you say, Nick, we're picking her up pretty much, well, very quickly into one of the zones when BFA launches. So for me, I think it was nice to get a recognition of Jaina, but I think you picked up a really good point. It did feel like a side story because the moment it happens, Kalik says to Anduin, "Oh, she's Jaina's all right, but she's not going to be here." And he's like, "Okay, cool. I've got other things to sort about. Where's new Aunt Kalia?" So I did think it was a very much a side note in that respect.
I would also,
Katie?
I was gonna say I would also agree that it felt a little weird to like sandwich it in, aside from the like, oh, new Jaina, and I was like, okay, new Jaina, but also this is not Jaina. but I think for me, one of the important points of putting Jaina in there is that they ended the relationship with Caligos like very firmly, and I think if you read the other books, Caligos has been a huge point of stability for Jaina, at least in a lot of times. Like, Jaina will do something in the game, and I'm like, oh, Jaina's flying off the handle, and then in the book, like, Caligos is like, Jaina, like, you know, come back to me, yada yada yada, and she seems to be more stabilized. I'm like, alright, like, okay, maybe Jaina's not so cray, and then, again, in the game, she'll go and fly off the handle. I'm like, oh, Jaina's doing it again, and then in another book, she'll be with Caligos, and she'll be like, but my dearest Jaina, yada yada yada. I'm like, okay, so she keeps, like, she has her up and downs, which Nick and I have talked a lot about. But this, to me, signals, like, the end of that, where it's like, okay, she goes up and down, and she has, like, the stabilization of someone else being like, hey, you're going a little cray here, like, can we calm down and think about it? And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think it's her character maturing. But it's also important to me to note, I think, that since Caligos won't be there, that won't be that stabilizing, neutral influence saying, hey, I think you're being a little tough on the Horde or whatever right now. So I think that was an important thing to bring in, but it does feel a little weird that they just, like, sandwiched one chapter in there. I'm like, why are we reading about Jaina? Like, I didn't think she was going to be in this novel, and then she was. And okay.
Yeah. And she's such a nexus for this franchise. She connects pretty much every character, it seems, in some way or another. So I'm not surprised she's as conflicted as she is, given the fact, you know, all her different motivations. She had a love interest with Arthas, but, you know, at the same time, you know, all this other stuff, Theramore, that I can understand that. But we're picking her up in BFA, so we'll move on for the sake of time. We'll skip over Turalyon and Greymane, because I think they're a little bit more side characters, perhaps a bit two-dimensional. But is there anything we want to say about those two?
I would just say that I was really surprised. Like, I was initially very surprised that Turalyon was very, like, anti-Forsaken. Like, it was like, but you knew this guy and he wields the light, and it's not just like they're terrible. I'm like, but you didn't, like, I don't think he was never here for the Forsaken plight. So I was a little surprised that he was so, like, I have these exact feelings about it. I'm like, but you weren't even here, man. Like, you weren't here for any of the devastation. You've heard all of this secondhand. So part of me was expecting him to be a little more like, oh, well, I'm going to approach this a little more openly because I've heard bad things, but I don't know exactly how I feel about it yet. But that's also not Turalyon's character at all.
It's not.
He's a paladin. Paladins always turn undead, so just by nature, he's against the Forsaken.
But Anduin picks up very quickly that he did work with a converted demon.
Yeah.
And I thought, as I was reading that bit just before that admittance by Anduin, I sat there and thought, hang on, he's worked with demons. He doesn't have any problem working with anybody.
Right.
Why has he got a problem? And then Anduin goes, but you were fine working with a demon. I did sit there and think, well, it just seems like you're just supposed to contrast with Greymane a bit, in the sense that you both start off in the same point, but you come round to it, and he doesn't quite.
Yeah.
I think
that's probably correct.
I think the biggest reason why he's probably against undead is it's a much more natural contrast to the light compared to even a demon, because, like, Fel and light aren't opposites, whereas the undead seem like, birthed directly from the shadow, basically. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. I don't think they're actually void, but it seems like a much more sharp contrast directly to it.
Yeah. They can't wield the light without feeling like massive amounts of pain and discomfort. Like, I'm trying to remember where they talk about this, but, like, I think it's one of the trainers. Like, they tell you, one of the Forsaken trainers tells you that when you wield the light, like, they can actually start to taste, like, the rot in their mouth. Like, they can start to get some senses back, and it's very unpleasant. And then if they're healed, it actually hurts them. So it's, like, a physically unpleasant thing for them to experience the light. So that's why there supposedly aren't a lot of Forsaken holy priests, or, there are 2 Forsaken paladins. But I'm like, Shadow Paladin should be a thing. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, who knows? Who knows?
But yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's talk about the character I've kept putting off for a while, and that's Calia Menethil. And the reason I've put her off is because I think there is such an important... she's such an important part of this book, especially at the end. So, rather than me spoil it by jumping in straight away, guys, Calia Menethil, discuss. What did you think of her? Gary, I'm going to start with you.
Alright, so I think for the first, like, half of the book, Like, until you... It's probably more than half the book. I don't know. I was driving the whole time. At any rate, time. We'll argue that.
A good time.
At any rate, until you figure out, like, her whole backstory, like, right before the meeting, I really thought they were trying to set up a love interest between her and Anduin. Like,
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so I'm not the only one. Yeah.
With all the talk of heirs,
Yep.
and then he starts, getting a bit close with it. I thought, here we go, royalty and royalty
Yeah.
is all going to come together, and no, apparently, not yet.
I mean, it
could still
I
happen.
was gonna say it could still happen, but I was like, that was one of those weird things where after the cataclysmic event for her happened, I was like, so it could be lead between peace and the Forsaken and the alliance with a union of marriage. And I was like, that just kind of feels a little weird.
She kept talking about her kid and her husband, which I
Yeah.
felt dampened the sexual chemistry.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. True.
Sorry, Gary,
No,
go
go
on.
ahead.
But other than that, she was a fascinating character. Like, this... She is very comparable to Anduin, I think, in, like, her type of character. Very, very... I'm all about the light. Like, I want peace. But more so than Anduin, I think you get to see a very shadowed past with her. I mean, that's nailed pretty heavily with her nightmares that she has. I think at least a few times during the book it's brought up. But she's a fascinating character, and I think there's a lot more to come with her, and I want to know what happens. Like, probably the best character out of this book for me. Anduin and Sylvanas were written really well, but Kalia left me going, I need to know everything that happens with this character, and I want it now. But, still gotta wait a couple months before I figure anything out.
And you're not the only one. I think there's a lot of lore videos into the child, because potentially that is the heir of Lordaeron. I disagree. I think Kalia at the end with her resurrection is set up as the complete antithesis of Sylvanas.
Here's the thing that I've been thinking about the child, because I love the idea of the child. And the child is introduced in that one dream that she has where she's holding the child, and then she gets the bony fingers of her husband, and then on my interpretation it was like, oh crap, her husband's a Forsaken. But we don't actually know that. We don't know what happened to the husband. But what if he was? Because then I started thinking, like, well, okay, so let's say that the husband got turned into a Forsaken when they were escaping, because we don't know what happened. What if the kid got turned into a Forsaken? Could there be like a 15-year-old Forsaken baby going around who would be like, have like the body of a baby, so it'd have to be carried around like on like a baby Bjorn or something by somebody all the time, but have like the mind of a 15-year-old knowing like, I'm the rightful king here. Like, that would be an amazing character to see.
I like it. I mean, it does bring up the interesting question of Forsaken children. I mean, that with all this family stuff going on, I did sit and think, like, surely there must have been, I know Blizzard can't do it, but there must have been dead kids in Lordaeron, and, I do wonder, but I guess Sylvanas wouldn't raise them because they're not particularly good at fighting if they're,
But
like,
this
10
one
years old.
she would, because it's the heir to Lordaeron.
No,
Like,
Would she, though?
Would she? She would not.
would she, if she needs to stop Kalia Menethil from taking power rightfully, because now if like, oh, the kid's the proper heir, not you, then therefore I will raise this kid, and I'll strap the baby Bjorn on myself, and therefore we together are king and queen.
So the fight is going to be over this baby soon, right? It's going to be Judge Judy meets Maury, just fighting over a child.
Out of curiosity, do you think Forsaken can, like, transplant brains? Like, they stitch on arms? Like, can you just whole new body for, 15-year-old baby? Like, hey, here's
Ultimately,
a fresh
yeah.
corpse. We'll let you use it.
I
Yeah,
don't-
might be a
if you
little
follow
bit
the
out
arm
of Blizzard's
yeah,
That's
style.
yeah.
that's
like-
kind of what they did to Nathanos.
well, I mean, what if they did a ceremony like they did with Nathanos?
Yeah?
I mean, that could be like they need someone. This is the long shot, right? So if they wanted to do something like that, they could technically. I don't think they would do it, but they could sacrifice Kalia, and the baby would be whatever preserved, because I think you need a living or semi-living relative, but she's like undead living but very dead.
Probably not Kalia.
I don't know. That's a long shot.
No, most likely though, as much as I like the idea of there being like undead forsaken baby,
That'd be terrifying.
I think most likely we're going to run into a 15-year-old kid at some point who is going to turn out to be the daughter. And we'll find out what happened to Kalia's husband. You don't introduce these two characters and then leave a big question mark over their fates without knowing that you're going to come back to them. Maybe they show up in BFA. I mean, it could be the type of thing where maybe they escaped to Kulturas, and that's why we haven't heard from them in the longest time.
Oh, that's true.
Or this might be something that they're putting in here for expansions down the line, knowing full well. Because why would you want to introduce the kid at this point when you can have a great argument about who should be ruling Lordaeron between Kalia and Sylvanas? Because, and that goes back earlier, we were asking, like, Gary, you said, like, Anduin's the one who orders the attack on Lordaeron. That would make a lot of sense if he's like, well, let's go to Lordaeron and let's boot out Sylvanas and let's install Kalia. That it's not that we want to kick the Forsaken out. The Forsaken can stay there. It's that they've been ruled by the wrong queen for the last 15 years, and we need to get the right one in there who can actually rule his people. And that's the kind of thing, like, it would make more sense if you view that cinematic, knowing that Kalia is, like, just off frame the entire time.
Which would make sense, because she would be off frame, because you wouldn't lead an alliance army and have a undead queen next to you, or at least you wouldn't bring her to the battlefield. So it could work. That, I mean, to me, I think she's supposed to replace Sylvanas, and I think the idea is that she's, not necessarily heading towards Lightforged Forsaken, but certainly going along that sort of route, giving Forsaken the Zera treatment, as it were. Cleansing them, maybe giving them back their minds and souls, and maybe a bit more. I don't know. I guess the idea that the book, going back touching on the Forsaken, was it seemed like the Forsaken just had borrowed time. Yes, like they were stitching themselves, they were holding out barely, and that's kind of where Sylvanas' fear comes from, because she knew she had to capture Ear. I can't remember who was Ear. Yeah. She had to capture, because the Forsaken haven't got long. They if they're not wanting their last death, they're heading towards it in any place. They're immortal in concept, but their bodies are not. So if another character is offering an option there, and a chance to reunite with their families, and a chance to inhabit Lordaeron and be a people again, I do wonder if that is just Sylvanas' game over moment, and maybe that's what Anduin decides. Is we've got it now, we've got a basis to not besiege the Undercity, but liberate Lordaeron. And that's where it is, I guess, for the cinematic, isn't it?
But I think you have to be really careful here, because the thing that Kalia and Anduin don't see, I believe, are the massive amount of Forsaken that are allied heavily with Sylvanas and share her viewpoints. Like, a lot of them do not like the living. A lot of them have completely written it off. A lot of them don't want to go back to that lifestyle. So Anduin being like, Kalia, you're gonna lead, and Kalia's like, yay! Like, a lot of the Forsaken be like, no, I don't want her to lead us. I don't like her. Like, maybe even if she is the rightful heir, like, maybe, I mean, not all of the Forsaken are people of Lordaeron. Like, most of them are the original denizens of Lordaeron, but not all of them are. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like, okay, so you're trying to take out a leader that a lot of us, that has shown genuine care for us, that has been here through all of our struggles, and you're going to try and put in this woman who's been in hiding for years, and she's, like, never shown any interest in our plight. She's never come around. Like, I feel like that would go horribly, and most of the Forsaken, a good part of them probably would want nothing to do with her. So, like, if that was, which it seems like a very tangible storyline for them to be like, yeah, let's just go put Kalia in and things will be great. I feel like that would cause a lot of unrest and go very, very quickly south, potentially.
Unless Kalia is actually Sylvanas', or the answer to Sylvanas' plans. Like, yes, hey, we're on a ticking time clock. Guess what? Your war chief, the dark lady that you love so much, can't get the job done, but I can. I've got the method already. I am what you are seeking to be. So follow underneath me, and let's make this happen. I
think that's going to split him in half.
Yes. Well, but the other interesting part is that there's got to be some kind of big plan here from a scale that, like, isn't brought up during the book at all, though, because the light is orchestrating this whole thing to happen.
Yes.
Which they never come out and say it, but from the first time you meet Kalia and see her nightmares, the light's like, hey, this is going to stop. We know it is. You just have to do something first. And then when she asks to go to the place with Anduin, Anduin asks the light, hey, this is not a good idea. Should I let this happen? Because I don't think I should. And the light's like, no, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Just bring her along.
Right.
And then everything goes south and they bring back her body. And then the light's like, and now you're basically a Forsaken, but not the same? Like, this... It would be foolish of me to not expect the light to have played a massive role or to have expected this all to happen.
Which, given what Sylvanas might be affected by, could be explain why there's a bigger, as you say, a bigger chess game going on.
Yeah.
I guess to use the chess metaphor we've been using.
Well, because I mean,
it almost seems like we're getting like the major forces, like the light and the void and like undeath, all converging and attacking each other, but it's a proxy war through Sylvanas and Kalia and Illyria, and I guess that's kind of like the best way for Blizzard to handle that. Like, you've got that chart that we got in Chronicle 1 that laid out the whole cosmology with all these different forces, and here it is, like, the fulcrum of all that are these characters right here, all personally related, all with stakes on the line, all actually coming through with their own actual like human foibles to kind of trip things up, but they're ultimately how it's going to matter. And I think that's an interesting way to tell the story of these greater forces, yet reducing it down to like a human scale.
That's a good point.
And it'd be, yeah, no, I agree. That is a really interesting one. And I think just lightly touching on what I think Katie, you might have said, or Nick, about, would it split the Forsaken? I guess if Sylvanas goes first, because of something, if we decide, well, just can't have her on because Teldrassil's gone and it's all going to pot and she's the problem, get rid of the War Chief, and then the Forsaken are stuck with nothing and there's an alternative offer, then that might help. But I guess we'll find out. I guess she's undoubtedly going to play a huge role in BFA, if not leading up to the end and the climax of it. But with maybe 10 minutes left, less than that, we've got plenty of time to discuss Anduin and Sylvanas. They're only small characters in this. No particular focus given.
Only a couple pages.
To them. Only a couple of pages. Yeah, a footnote. I think it was mentioned at the back. They weren't really supposed to be mentioned at all, actually.
Well, you've been talking about Sylvanas the whole time, though.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we've covered pretty much all of their motivations. But, as we've said before, I think they were really well done. And I really liked, in particular, the inner turmoil that is Anduin, trying to live up to the idea of his father, conflicted about how his father went. I love that scene where he just outright asked Sylvanas, did you betray us?
Yes.
Or betray my father? And I really liked how she responded to that. It's just getting that deep into the characters, both of them, I really enjoyed. And despite the fact that the tones of them were very different, Anduin is defined by hope. In fact, hope just constantly comes up when Anduin's talking. It's just a word he always uses. And fury is just a word similarly associated with Sylvanas. She just cannot use any other emotion but fury. She sees, a cockroach going across the floor and she's unbridled fury seeds across her face. So for you guys, I guess if we start to wrap this up, Anduin and Sylvanas, happy with the presentation. I think we all are, but what in particular really impressed you, or perhaps even didn't impress you about how they were portrayed? Nick, start with you.
Well, first I just have to say I love the innovation of Anduin human lie detector.
Yes, yes.
That was just a brilliant thing, and it worked out very well. Even as Gary pointed out, that like the light was able to like trick him with Kalia. That it's like, no, you do this, you trust her. But no, I think you said it best, that like Anduin is just so full of hope and positivity, and Sylvanas is just not that. I mean, and that scene where they conflict each other, it was actually where, for once, Anduin let the fury kind of take him over a little bit, Like, he asked that question without any sense of hope. Like, he just needs to know. And Sylvanas, for once, drops all pretenses and gives him an honest answer and is just like, your father was dead either way. Like, I can't explain to you just how screwed we were up there and, you know, everything that was going on, but the Legion was going to kill your dad no matter what. Like, it had nothing to do with anything I could have been trying. And that moment, to see the two of them connect on such a level that if anything, that actually gives you a little bit of hope for those characters, that there's the tiniest morsel of like a link between the two of them that they can work off of. And it'll be damn near impossible, especially now that Anduin has pretty much given up everything else for her. But I guess the one thing you can say is that Anduin is not, when Anduin finally does go after Sylvanas, he's not doing it out of any concern about his father, that they made sure that aspect of it was dead and buried. That maybe he might do it on behalf of Kalia because he clearly looks up to her, but at least it's not like he's going after Lordaeron like, no, we have to avenge my father. This is something completely different. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how those two play out.
Gary, you look like you got an idea in mind. Or something
Do you
to say, at least.
wonder at all if that might not be how Anduin ends up spinning the war, though? Like, hey, this is really a war because we just need Sylvanas out, and like I have all of these back plans that I want to do, and I want to bring peace, but she needs to go in order for that to happen. But when I talk to everyone in Stormwind, it's gonna be to avenge my father, like our king, which would be kind of interesting because that feels very much like a Sylvanas thing to do. So I'm curious if we see Anduin start kind of walking Sylvanas's path in order to, you know, end Sylvanas. It would also be interesting to see if Sylvanas ends up kind of changing her path. Maybe we figure something out. Maybe there's not the fear of the Forsaken rotting away at some point, and she just becomes, you know, a good leader, and it actually brings some hope back for her. And you start seeing her walk much more closely to Anduin's path by the end of the expansion. Which I don't think will happen, honestly, because Sylvanas and I expect her to die this expansion more than to change. But I think it could turn out to be a very good story.
I just want to jump in here. I don't think Sylvanas is going to die. I have this odd feeling, and there's no basis for this whatsoever. I have this odd feeling that at the end of this, Sylvanas is like returned back to her elven state.
I don't think she's going to die either. Like, I think that's too predictable at this point, right? Like, that's one of those things because a lot of people love Sylvanas dearly. Like, she's, in my opinion, she's one of the most recognizable Warcraft characters. Like, she's like Arthas, right? Where someone that has no idea what World of Warcraft is, they're like, oh, I've seen that weird dark elf chick with red eyes. Like, I don't know if she's a vampire, but she has a bow, but I've seen her everywhere, right? So, I mean, it's very possible they could kill her, but I don't know, like, I feel like it's kind of too predictable. I want to see this crazy redemption for her of some kind. Like, she might get turned, like, she might have some sort of weird thing happen where she's like Kalia and she can become like a Lightforged Sylvanas. I don't know, but they specifically did say they don't want it to be a Garrosh 2.0 scenario where it's like, oh, she starts to go cray, so we kill her. I think everyone, like, on the Alliance side wants her to die, because I think Blizzard and this book has done a really good job of people being like, oh, she's terrible, like, we need to remove her. But if you read her character, like, at least how she was portrayed in the book, which I loved, I feel like there's some internal conflict on things. Like, she wants to present herself a very specific way, which is interesting. Like, you know, there was a part where she's like, oh, she wanted to reach down and grab Nathanos' hand, but she didn't, because she's like, that would, you know, show weakness on my part. And I was like, so her character is very complicated, and I don't think she's just straight evil like everyone is thinking she is. And that's one of the things I've loved about this book, is they did a really good job making sure that she isn't purely evil. Like, she has motivations, she has thoughts, but she's very paranoid. And I think it'd be really...
I honestly hate the description of evil for Sylvanas, because she really isn't. Like,
No.
She is cold, she is logical, but she's not evil. She doesn't do things out of malicious intent. She does things to make sure things go the way she needs them to go. And
Yes.
if it comes down to murdering her people to do it, that's what she'll do. But it's not like she gets joy out of it. And
No.
then she'll rationalize it in a way that makes it sound better, too. Because, like, when she finally does that, she's like, and today I gave them 2 gifts, because these are the people that wanted their final death. Like, I killed them, but they wanted to die, so it's okay.
And you're just like,
So is she like lawful neutral then?
Chaotic neutral. No.
chaotic.
Yeah, chaotic
no,
neutral.
well, I guess she can be.
No,
I don't-
it would have to be true neutral. She's too conniving to be chaotic neutral.
True.
D&D alignments. Yes.
Yeah, it's nice to fit everyone into a box. Definitely.
Well, I wanted.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sorry, Katie, go on.
Well, I wanted to touch on Anduin's character growth really quickly before.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Before we moved on.
before we wrap up. Yeah.
Well, like, one of the things that we saw about Anduin is that he did grow up a lot in this novel, which has been really interesting. Like, he has some of the chips on his shoulder from Gen, like his relationship with Bane, Kalia, but especially at the end when everything goes horribly south and he's like, I feel so betrayed, like, how could this have happened? Like, all of those feelings are like, okay, we're starting to see Anduin finally, at least in my mind, transition into wartime Anduin, where he's going to be out on the battlefield and he's starting to get more, like, hardened. He's like, things have happened and I'm ready to, fight people. Like, physically, I'm getting there. I'm, like, not being the pacifist Anduin anymore. So I thought they did a really good job taking his very pacifist nature and then starting to slowly kind of change him into what we see in the Battle for Azeroth cinematic, which, as Nick and I were talking about earlier, was very surprising the first time. It was like, Anduin would never be on the battlefield. Like, I mean, he does go and cry and resurrect a bunch of people, so that was,
But he does smash a troll's face in right just before
Poor
that.
sappy boy. I'm so sad.
He caves in a troll. I think that was probably the best bit of that entire cinematic.
I don't think.
That troll was so
I think
beautiful.
the troll
Why
was
would you
still
do that?
alive. I think he just got buried. Honestly, you never really see the body. You just see dust and no more troll. So
I was saying trolls are hard to kill. So.
yeah.
He's waiting for a respawn of the spirit. Let's put it that way.
Just sit there.
So yeah, I guess. I mean, when it comes to where Sylvanas will go, actually, if I flip it, I think this book had a real job. This is me starting to do my wrap up. I think it had a real job to not really bring Sylvanas anywhere. I think it had to expand Sylvanas. I think you're right. Sylvanas' story is going to end. Her story is going to end in this expansion. Whether she dies or not, I'm not sure. All we can say is it's going to end. And the reason I say that is purely because of merchandise. Blizzard has released a statue of Grom, Illidan, and Sylvanas. And the first 2 were released, and then the characters were removed from the main story. And the only way Sylvanas can be removed from the main story, in my mind, is because she disappears. Whether she comes back to life and finds solitude, lives in Windrunner Tower, that sort of stuff, I'm not sure. But the book, I think, had to bring Anduin to Sylvanas. I think, literally, in that matchup scene where they're facing off each other, the book had spent all its legwork making sure that looked like an equal matching. And the comments on Little Lion, he's like, "No, I'm King Anduin, biatch." You address me like that. And I think it did a really wonderful job with Anduin to get him there, to think about his motivations, and the sort of finality of that final line where he says, Sylvanas has to go. That's it, and close book. And I think there is no question that Sylvanas has to leave, but what she'll do in the meantime, I'm not entirely sure, but it's going to be incredible. Wrapping up for the sake of time, are there any last thoughts that you guys wanted to share on the book as a whole, or a general view out of 10, if such a thing is possible? I don't know if you can view these out of 10 or score them. Nick, you look like you.
The only thing I'll say is that I think Anduin has realized Sylvanas has to go. The question is, will Sylvanas realize that she has to go, and what will she do if she does?
Mm-hmm.
I agree. She'll go full Banshee, definitely. Gary?
I love the book. Everything about it. Not everything about it. I have one issue with the book, and that's that I was hoping to read this and go, and now I know how the battle for Azeroth begins. And instead I'm like, I mostly do, but there's so many more questions than I have.
Yeah.
Now that I've read the book, I have like 20 more different questions and theories on how this could all play out. And I want to see the conclusion to it. And I think that'll be in game, and I'm excited for it. But I'm an impatient nerd, and I want to have it now. So come on, Blizz, hurry it up.
Well, we only got 5 weeks to go, or 6 weeks to go.
You say that,
less than that, probably.
but we're not going to get a resolution to the Kalia story till at least the very last patch of the expansion. Like, and that's heartbreaking to me. It really is, because I want to see how this plays out.
Okay, is going to abandon the old ship. So, Nick. Nick, talking about the book in general, just a final thought from you. You mentioned, obviously, your point on Anduin. As the book, though, what did you think?
One thing I didn't realize until I was actually talking with Katie about this the other week, is why it was called Before the Storm. It didn't occur to me. And like when we got that original second chapter with Sylvanas and it ends with her like, oh, we're going to attack Stormwind, I was expecting we'd get a book where we'd go attack Stormwind, we'd find out what happens with the burning of Teldrassil, all this stuff. And then I realized like all that actual conflict would be the storm. This needed to be the stuff before that. Like the word that's missing from that title is the calm. Right? It's 2 words. Like the calm is what's missing from there. And that's really what this book was. It was 200 and some odd pages of just like a slow build until finally there was a conflict that like, and it took me about halfway through the book to kind of realize like, oh, like I was like, well, when something's going to happen, I'm like, nothing's going to happen. Like, we're not going to get Teldrassil. We're not going to get all that stuff. All that stuff's going to come later when, like, the you know, when stuff really hits the fan. This is, like, putting the fan in place and putting the stuff in front of it to make sure everything actually hits it properly. So, yeah, I do have to say I did it. Once I realized that, I think it was very aptly named.
I agree. I think, it does sit in my mind that not a single wartime casualty happened, and that's kind of the weird thing, isn't it? Despite that final scene, like the massacre at the Gathering, and I remember closing the book because I got to the chapter where they were starting the Gathering, or they'd started meeting people, and I decided just to stupidly glance ahead, see how much, you know, and one of the chapters starts the slaughter, and I thought, okay, definitely, nicely, but lo and behold, no one actually gets killed in a wartime atrocity, so to speak. But as you say, we're going to pick it up soon. Katie, your thoughts on the book?
Yes. So I would have to agree with everyone where I was shocked because I was like, oh yeah, we're going to get into like Teldrassil and we're going to start to see how this is going to happen, because I fully expected there to be more, because I haven't done any of the spoilers for like what's on the PTR for what's coming. So I'm like, oh, this has got to like kind of tie in, because we know that Teldrassil is supposed to be this giant cataclysmic moment that's supposed to kickstart, you know, like, it's very ambiguous. Like, at the beginning, we're like, oh, you know, Sylvanas wants Stormwind. And I'm like, okay, but she wants Stormwind. Why did we go to Teldrassil? So, and she keeps talking about it. She's like, oh yeah, we're going to go and attack Stormwind. We're going to knock down Stormwind. We're going to take Stormwind. And I'm like, but how do we get to Teldrassil? Like, Teldrassil is the completely opposite continent, way out of the way. It doesn't have any resources we know of that you want, besides, like, maybe lumber. But then you burn it down, so that doesn't... and, like, the only thing I could think of is, like, okay, well, Gen is there, so maybe he does something in this book that really upsets her. But then we start going through the book, and it's like, oh, well, we're just reuniting families, and we're understanding the properties of Azerite, and it's like, well, where is the tree burning? Like, I'm not sure where this is supposed to happen. So I was really surprised by all the plots in this book. I loved it, but it definitely set up way more questions than answers, and, as someone that enjoys the lore, that makes me want to pull out my hair and dance happily at the same time. So,
but 6 weeks before the expansion comes out, I think that's not a bad situation to be in.
If it makes you feel any better,
and
even the people who have spoiled the PTR and beta still have no idea what is going on in Teldrassil. It's a big deal right now.
Well,
I'm glad.
I think Christie Golden let it slip, because I think it's clear that feathers wasn't quite shot out the sky and managed to land on Teldrassil, then sparked and blew up. So actually it was feathers who burned down Teldrassil. It was a horrible, flammable incident because obviously What's-His-Face didn't build it. It was made by Safranetta, who obviously could have advised on proper health and safety guidance, which is what this story is all about at the end of the day. You know, fire safety is important, kids. Stay away from burning trees, especially Teldrassil. And with that happy note, I think we've done an impossible job. I think we've we've discussed a lot of the book in that time. We carried ourselves through it very briskly, and I think we'll leave it at that. So I think it's a wholehearted recommendation from all of us. Check out this book. In fact, I think it's almost kind of mandatory. It feels a little bit mandatory in the sense of getting to understand a little bit about the motivations of the characters as we head into the storm, as you say, Nick. The calm is well and truly over now. But I want to thank you guys for joining me. I want to thank everyone at home for listening. Hope you enjoyed the book. Let us know. Get in touch with Tauren and Goblin, Geeks of Azeroth, and let us know what you thought. Nick, Katie, Sleepy Gary, I'm going to go round. Nick, where can people find you if they particularly want to get onto your points about Anduin and all that stuff?
I talk more about Sylvanas than Anduin usually.
Well, that's it.
I am at WookieBH on Twitter, and you can also find Tauren Goblin at Tauren Goblin on Twitter. We have the Twitter handle back.
Nice.
Yes.
Fantastic. Are you somewhat older in age than the heir to Lordaeron now?
I am, yes. And unofficially, I guess the podcast is, even though it's not. It's a zombie baby.
For context for listeners, what was it? You set your age, your birthday on Twitter as like 2 years old, so it blocked you.
Because so the podcast is going to be 2 years old this summer, and so I set the age as 2 years old, and you need to be 13 to be on Twitter. So the Twitter handle got shut down briefly, but it's back.
It's back, like a resurrected Forsaken.
Like the sister of an evil Death Knight who suddenly shows up out of nowhere. It's back.
Excellent. Katie, where can people find you?
You can find me at HyruleMaster77 on Twitter. You can also find me under the Tauren Goblin. And then you can also find me and a couple other of my friends at Three Goblins Trenchcoat, which is just another basic Blizzard podcast that I do. So.
Fantastic. And Steve Gary, I feel like I shouldn't need to ask you this, but where can people find you?
I feel like you've asked me this before today, even. So you can find me at Epic Geeks Gary. You can also find Geeks of Azeroth at Geeks of Azeroth, I do believe. And we stream Geeks of Azeroth Sunday mornings at 10 or 11 Mountain Time. Don't ask me to convert because I'm not good at it.
6 p.m. GMT or whatever time zone we seem to be working in. God knows. So yeah, that's all good stuff. So you can find me at Britzer_EG. I don't know why you'd want to. It's just pictures of Nomi and things like that I post on a daily basis. And that's about it. So again, thank you so much for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoy the book. If you do read it, check it out if you haven't. And I guess we'll see you in, 6 weeks or so when we cover, Katie, what book's next?
So that's
undecided.
I was gonna say we're gonna have to discuss it because we could either go orcs or night elves, which I think we might need to lean towards night elves, but we'll need to discuss it.
Even after this book, faction decisions are still a thing.
Impartial opinion from someone who probably won't be here next time. Go with the night elves because
the night elves are excellent.
The tree's not gonna be around for much longer. Give them a little bit of love.
That's true.
I see it. We'll all buy the physical copies just to kill real trees as well. That's brilliant.
We're consistent.
Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, exactly, if anything. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you on the next show and have a great week in gaming.